Hello, this is the Overtones podcast, a show about the beauty of diversity within Christianity today. I'm Joe, and I'm a church worker.
I'm Christy, and I'm a church historian.
And I'm LaRae. I'm a Christian teacher. On our show, we talk to academics, professionals, and full-time church workers to explore lesser-heard voices that are shaping the church today.
When I was a junior lawyer in Malaysia, I was assisting another firm on a case, and it was a case for an injunction, and it was to prevent the deportation of an individual. The authorities had said that this particular individual had entered the country illegally, and so basically they wanted to kick him out. And the application was particularly important because we believe that this person was from a nearby country where there was significant political instability. And we believe that if he was to be made to return to his country, he would be detained and he would potentially be killed by the authorities there. And it had happened before to people we knew and his friends. So we got in the news that the deportation was going to take place in the afternoon. So we had like an urgent hearing in the morning to have that stayed. Stayed basically means like suspended or put on hold until the trial can be heard to determine whether this person had actually entered the country illegally. Long story short, we lost the application. I remember thinking that I really couldn't believe it because this is like the classic case where you would get an injunction, because if you don't get an injunction, something bad is going to happen that you cannot fix later. But the judge was kind of not really listening to us. That's how I felt. And although we rushed to file an appeal, it was basically too late. I got the news later that afternoon that he had already been forced onto a plane and had left the country. And I remember I was having lunch with my friends and I just started crying because I just genuinely felt like because of me, someone had died.
Thank you, Allyna, for joining us today to share your experience as a lawyer in both Malaysia and in London. Welcome to another episode of the Overtones podcast. Today we have Allyna Ng coming to another episode to share her experience as a lawyer in both Malaysia and in the UK. So welcome, Allyna. So, Allyna, would it be possible for you to talk a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm Allyna. I grew up in Malaysia and then I came to the UK to do my undergrad in law. And then I did the bar in the UK, which is basically like a qualification course. And then I went back to Malaysia to do my pupillage, which is like the training period for a lawyer. That was for 12 months, and then after that I stayed on in a firm to work as a lawyer in Malaysia for a bit. And then I came back to the UK to do my pupillage here. So that way I get qualified in both Malaysia and the UK if I wanted to practice as a lawyer in either country.
So you haven't really decided where you want to stay for long term yet?
I mean, I kind of know that long term I don't want to be in the UK, but the kind of quality of training that you get here is really, really good. And it's a Commonwealth country, so like I guess it's applicable in whichever country I may end up in.
I remember when you were called to bar. I went. Is that the call to bar thing? The one that you invited me to?
Yeah.
At Lincoln's Inn? Right.
Yes.
That was very cool. I mean, like it was. I don't think I've ever had a chance to go to Lincoln's Inn, but I happened to do Puritan history and on a guy called Edward Reynolds who was preacher at Lincoln's Inn. So I saw his like kind of like historical stuff briefly there. So that was pretty cool. So are you still like I don't know how that works. Is it still based there? Were you based in a firm? How does that work? The whole kind of training thing that you're doing right now?
So I'm doing the training in London right now, and how that works is that I guess I'm based in a what you would normally understand as a firm, but because it's a firm of barristers, it's called a set of chambers, and it doesn't really operate like I guess how you would understand a law firm to operate. So basically all the barristers in the chambers are self-employed, so we don't have a boss. Like no one tells us kind of this is your case, this is what you should do. So there's quite a lot of autonomy over like which cases you want to do and how much time you want to spend working. I think that's the big kind of draw. Yeah, but as a pupil, I get assigned to supervisors every 3 months, so I just kind of assist on their work, and then at the same time I'm also assessed. So at the end of the 9 months, they'll give me a decision on whether or not they think I've met the standard for being a barrister. And if I have, then I will get taken on, and then I can become a self-employed barrister, and that's it.
So there's a chance that they might say, "Oh, not up to par, not up to standard." Really? Wow,
There's
that's quite
definitely a
competitive.
chance. Actually, it's not a low chance.
Okay, wow. Well, that's challenging.
So what drew you to law originally, Allyna?
I guess the answer that I usually give is my parents are lawyers, and I wasn't very good at math. That's
Love it. I love it.
Nice.
yeah, so that meant I couldn't be like a doctor, an engineer, or an accountant, which are like the other three acceptable Asian occupations. So then I ended up with law. But yeah, I guess genuinely, like, I always felt like it was something that suited my abilities as well as my interests. So I've always been, I was doing debating when I was quite young, public speaking, and I've always liked like words, like reading, writing, speaking. And I've always also been interested in kind of helping people, or I guess particularly in Malaysia, the thing that really moved me were like, I heard this story about the indigenous people in Malaysia who were kind of being exploited. And I remember thinking, oh, don't we have laws to say that this can't happen? And apparently we do.
Okay.
But it's just a matter of like accessing the law and enforcing it. And that is quite a problem in Malaysia. And I thought, well, if I can be a lawyer and I can know the law and help people to know the law and help people to access their rights, then that would be quite cool.
Did you grow up as a Christian or in a Christian home?
Yes.
Okay, so did that somehow influence your decision to go into law?
Yeah, I mean, definitely I felt like it was also kind of quite a Christian job, I think, being a lawyer. It's the idea of like, we have a God who loves justice and who will one day make all things just in a way that maybe the judiciary or the judicial system cannot do today. And yeah, so it was definitely also like in my personal statement for law, I had the whole like Micah 6:8, you know, like, what's the law require of you? To act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God, which people told me to take out actually. But yeah, I guess that was one of the big reasons why I wanted to be a lawyer.
Did you include it at the end?
Yeah, I did. As in,
Okay.
I moved it from the start to the end. So like kind of hoping that someone would read a statement, be kind of convinced that this person should get in, and then read the end and be like, oh no, she's a Christian. Well, should I really let that affect my decision? Yeah.
Smart.
As a Christian, how have you found working on cases that maybe both align with what you believe, but also don't align with what you believe?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think for cases that align with your beliefs, that's quite an easy one. It's always fun to work on something just because it involves the law, but it's kind of extra meaningful when you're really fighting for the side that you think should win. Like objectively, you feel like this side should win because it would be just for this outcome. And I've had a couple of instances where I had those cases. For example, in Malaysia, I was doing quite a lot of freedom of religion cases. So those are cases where, for example, I had a client who had married a Muslim. She was originally Christian, but in order to marry a Muslim in Malaysia, you need to also convert to Islam. That's just the law. So she had done that, and then after that, things had kind of gone wrong in the marriage, and now she wanted to come back to Christianity. Well, her case was she had always been a Christian, and she had never kind of let go of who Jesus was, but she had just kind of put it aside, and she had never practiced, she never gone to the mosque, she never prayed to Allah. She just always been a Christian in her heart, and she just wanted that to be declared the case. And she had gone to the Sharia court. So in Malaysia, like, the Sharia courts govern Islamic matters, and then the civil courts govern kind of non-Muslim matters. And the Sharia courts had basically said no. Once a Muslim, forever Muslim, essentially. Or there are certain requirements, and you meet the requirements for Muslim, therefore we cannot let you leave. So we had to take it to the civil courts to try to say, you know, what they're doing is wrong. Yes, it is an Islamic matter, I guess, to some extent, about whether or not someone should stay in Islam. We had some arguments against that. But also, there's kind of no transparency. Like, no one tells you, what do you need to do to leave? And the idea being there's this whole ambiguity around, like, am I really a Muslim? Will I forever be a Muslim? So that was one of the cases that was really meaningful for me, because I've always believed in freedom of religion. And one of my like greatest hopes is that Malaysia would be a country where like everyone has an equal chance to hear the gospel. And right now that just isn't the case.
Is it the case that in Malaysia you can't evangelize?
It's not that you can't. The position is like technically you can. I think most Christians feel like practically you can't. And we get around it by sometimes like sharing your story rather than, telling people to come to church. But there's actually kind of no law specifically saying you can't evangelize to a Muslim.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And actually there is no law saying that you can't leave Islam. This is controversial.
Okay.
But as far as I understand the constitution, there's no law saying you can't leave Islam. And so technically the Sharia courts do have the power to allow you to leave, and apparently they have done so in certain cases. The problem is no one knows what those cases, which side of the line you fall under. Will you be allowed to leave? Will you not be allowed to leave? And often before you're allowed to leave, they make you go through a whole set of courses or counseling to try to convince you to stay. We say all of those things are obstacles to, they're violations of your right to freedom of religion. But yeah, it's not illegal in the sense, in the same sense that most Malaysians would understand it to be.
Okay. So what happened to the woman then?
Well, we lost.
Okay.
I guess the thing is that what we have to do is this thing called a judicial review. So basically you go to the civil courts and say, the Sharia courts have made their decision and it's either irrational, procedurally inappropriate, and you want the civil courts to kind of review the Sharia courts. And that's quite controversial because people see it as kind of an attack on Islam or an interference in something that it would usually be within their jurisdiction. We say that's constitutionally not the case. The civil courts are higher than the Sharia courts, and the Sharia court operates like a tribunal essentially in the UK. So it's considered a lower court in that sense, and we don't mean that as any sort of disrespect to Islam, although it usually is taken that way. But the civil courts should have overall jurisdiction, and they have jurisdiction to say if someone's making a wrong decision. I guess it's also political, right? Like no judge wants to be the person saying, yes, I can interfere in these things because I have the power. And especially if a judge is Chinese, they're, I guess, even more concerned about the ramifications of that kind of societally, politically. So it's a difficult one. Usually when you go to the civil courts, the answer that they will give you is, no, we will not interfere. And there are cases that have set out, in what cases we will interfere, in what cases we won't. But yes, it's kind of a difficult process.
Sounds like it. What has been maybe some of the major differences in practicing law in the UK then, in contrast with practicing law in Malaysia?
I guess I don't really have a fair comparison because technically I haven't practiced in the UK. I've only been a pupil. But pupillage in the UK is quite different from pupillage in Malaysia. Pupillage in the UK is much more kind of focused on supporting you as an individual, trying to give you the skill set that you need to be a self-employed barrister, because obviously once you get there, no one's really going to be holding your hand. Whereas in Malaysia, it's very much like you work as a junior lawyer, you assist on all the cases.
Right.
If that requires photostating, you photostat, if that requires staying up until midnight, you do that. Whereas here, it's very much protected, 9 to 6, we want your work-life balance to be good. We don't want you to be too stressed. We just want you to do enough pieces of work for us to be able to assess you and for you to get a good idea of how this area of law looks. So it's quite different. In terms of kind of the setup of the judiciary generally, I guess it would be similar. Because Malaysia is a Commonwealth country, we inherited quite a lot from the UK. I do think the court system in the UK is more complex, but that could be because of the history of the thing. There are just so many courts in the UK that don't exist in Malaysia. You have so many different tribunals. In Malaysia, you just have High Court, Court of Appeal, and then Federal Court. And you do have magistrates courts that do kind of the equivalent of county courts here, so smaller cases, but that's basically it. But here you have Special Education Needs Tribunal, First Tier Tribunal, Upper Tribunal, King's Bench Division. Within that you have Information Technology Courts. It's just much more complicated. I mean, that could be because of the way that the court system has developed over time.
Thanks so much, Allyna. We've covered so much there, especially to do with Malaysia, but can you draw us back to your work here in the UK and cases that you're taking here? And we talked about freedom of religion, but that's not really a problem, I guess, in the UK. Have there been cases in the UK that you've worked on that you've been, I guess, more uncomfortable working on, or you wouldn't have chosen?
Yeah, definitely. And I think as a pupil, it's very much more like I do whatever cases my supervisors are working on. So in that sense, I also have less of a say. And I think in the UK, I generally don't get as many human rights cases, mostly because that's not the field of law that my supervisors have been practicing in. But there have definitely also been cases where I kind of feel like we've ended up on the wrong side. And it's a difficult one because as a lawyer, your job is to put your client's best case, whatever is in their best interest, even if you don't necessarily feel like that should be the just outcome, right? Like as an example, one of the cases I was working on was about like EU law and what we call agency workers regulations. For agency workers, they need to be given certain levels of protection. Agency workers are essentially workers that act on like an agency basis, so they don't have kind of a permanent workplace, they don't have like a permanent contract of employment. They kind of have a contract with usually some sort of middleman company, and then that company outsources them to whoever kind of needs help on kind of a temporary basis. So like Sainsbury, for example, might need like 100 workers right now to like, move something, and then you would just go there for a week and then you come back and then you go somewhere else. So the problem with workers like these is that they often don't have very much protection, because obviously big companies are kind of like, you're only going to be with me for a week. I'm not going to give you, like a bonus, pensions, things like that. Yeah, you don't have the same level of protection. So the regulations are designed to ensure that these workers have some level of protection. For example, equal pay with people who are doing similar kind of work to them. So some actual Sainsbury employee who's also, moving cars should be paid the same rate as someone who you've just brought in for a week because they're doing the same job. So my task was basically to interpret the regulations in such a way that these particular claimants or individuals did not fall within the definition of an agency worker. And obviously we had kind of technical legal arguments as to why that wouldn't be the case. But I genuinely felt that they should be. They essentially were doing the work of agency workers, and everyone had agreed at the time that they started working for this company that they would be treated like agency workers and that company would abide by the agency worker regulations. But because of kind of a loophole in the law or the way that the law has been interpreted, it was kind of arguable that they fell within a lacuna, as we call it, within the law that says, actually they may not fall within. And when the other side pointed out things like, this is just unfair, these are obviously intended to protect them, our answer is, well, it's for Parliament to legislate. Now we've identified a hole, and it's not for the court to come now and say, well, there is a hole, I'm going to fix it. Because Parliament has, maybe unintentionally, we say intentionally, created a hole. And then if they want to fix it, they can. But it's not our place to do it. And we won.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, did I really go to Oxford in order to use my brains to find a loophole in the law to prevent people from being protected under regulations which are purposed to protect them, right? And yes, there is value in every lawyer doing his best for a case. That's obviously true. You have to do your best for a case, even if it's not really something that you believe in, because otherwise the justice system doesn't function as well. Right? It functions with two sides arguing the case to the best of their ability, and then the judge being in the middle, being able to decide. But I guess the imperfection of the justice system is just that systemically it is imperfect. There is no ideal situation in which you have two lawyers who are of equal ability, a judge who is absolutely fair, and parties who, if everything went exactly to plan, that justice will always be served. That's just not how it works. And often better money just gets you better lawyers, and better lawyers maybe means you would get better arguments, and better arguments, you don't always get a judge who can see the better argument on the other side, even if the lawyer is not there to present it, right? Often judges rely quite a lot on lawyers to give them the arguments that they need. The imperfections of the system just means that I guess there will be situations where I will win even though I should not be winning, because I have used my abilities to win for my client. So I guess as a Christian, that's sometimes quite hard.
I think what you pointed out is just an age-old question, isn't it? On the one side, we had this ideal of a lawyer, and maybe not just lawyers, but Christians, like as image bearers, we all long for justice, and even non-Christians can loudly advocate the restoration of justice in different scenarios. But then on the other side, as Allyna, you've mentioned very accurately and very kind of perceptively, that our world is imperfect in our legal systems, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Malaysia, they are imperfect. And as Christian lawyers, that you in some way living in this tension. And that reminds me, actually, there are a lot of lawyers in the history of the church who wanted to in some way promote the Christian cause. Puritanism, for example, you have lots of lawyers who wanted to protect kind of Puritan schemes of promoting godly preaching, but then they were brought to court. And you have lawyers who wanted to defend their cause, but then lost. And you just mentioned two different cases that you were involved in, and the one in Malaysia, one in the UK, and you somehow lost to an extent on a personal level. And I wonder whether that brought you any reflections that maybe we're not lawyers, aren't we? But whether your experience have in some way taught you, like, how do you, I guess, reconcile the tension? How do you keep going as a lawyer, as a Christian?
I think it's a difficult tension to reconcile. I'm not really sure it's one that will really be reconciled in our time on earth. I guess I would like to improve the systems, the justice system, so that it kind of works towards the ideal that it's meant to. But that's quite hard, like making systemic change. I think that's one way that we can see that maybe the tension has some hope of being resolved here on earth. But I guess no matter how hard we try, our justice system is just never going to be as perfect as the justice that God brings when Jesus comes again. And that's just something that we have to live with, right? Like the justice that we bring here on earth, yes, it affects lives, but it's always going to be flawed in one way or another. And I guess as a lawyer, maybe part of it is just playing my role. Like, I know that the role that I play as a lawyer is meaningful, and we are helping people, and we work as part of a system that as a whole is purposed to achieve justice, whether that's in the UK or Malaysia, right? Maybe there are more problems with the justice system in Malaysia, but ultimately I do believe that even our judges, they want to do what's fair, they want to do what's right. They may not always get it right, but that's just human, and we can never hope to always get it right here on this earth. But we are all part of a system that is trying to achieve justice for the people in our society, and that's a fundamentally good thing. So that's part of it. I guess the other part of it is trying to kind of mitigate the parts of the system that aren't working as well. For example, I'm really hoping that I can do more pro bono cases. So that's basically cases that I take for free. I will have a lot more autonomy to do that here in the UK than I would do as an employed lawyer in Malaysia. And that just means someone will get quite a good quality of lawyer for a very low price, and that would probably hopefully help to mitigate some of the effects of when you can only get as good representation as your money can buy. I guess the other way is that at least in the UK, the ethical principles are taken quite seriously. So just because your client can buy you with their money, in inverted commas, it doesn't mean that they can force you to do whatever they wish you would do for them in court. For example, lying to the judge. Some advocates might be better at lying than others, but ultimately their lies can't be bought. And that's how we make sure that the justice system functions as equally as we can make it, right? Because ultimately, it means that advocates can only ever tell the judge something that is true. And no matter how good of an advocate you are, like if something is true, it's just true, and you can't tell the judge otherwise. And the judge will only ideally have true facts before him or her to decide a case. And that helps the justice system to function better. So maybe that's one of the things that as a Christian lawyer, I hope to take quite seriously when I do practice here. That it's this idea of like, I have boundaries. I don't serve my client in the same way that maybe other lawyers would. Ultimately, I serve God, and I serve also, I guess, the purposes of the justice system, which is to bring about justice in a way that I think God will be pleased with, and that fundamentally reflects his character.
So I guess how do we as a church support people like you, like a Christian lawyer? What are the weaknesses, like the unique weaknesses that you might have that we might not see? when we see you on Sunday or in Bible studies? Are there things that you are willing to share with us that help us understand your day-to-day struggles or the triumphs and the failures you feel like are very personal to you as a lawyer?
One of the things that is something that I've kind of already touched on, which is this idea of drawing ethical lines. Like, I phrase it as like lying or not lying, but it's not always, I guess, as black and white as that. It's very gray in a lot of cases. And I think lawyers especially need a lot of prayer and wisdom to decide what they should do in certain situations where there are lots of external pressures, right? Like, maybe if I give an example, there was once when I was in Malaysia, I was working on a case. I was doing some research for our case, and I found lots of cases that were helpful to us, but I found also a few cases that maybe were not that helpful. And then the question is, like, do I tell the judge about these cases that are also unhelpful and in so doing sort of undermine my case, right? But then can I really pretend that these cases don't exist and tell the judge, this is the law. These are all the cases that tell us what the law is. Like that. Ethically, I think the obviously correct answer would be you have to put all the relevant cases before the judge. That's the answer you give in the bar ethics course, But I guess in practice, not everyone does that. And it's quite easy to kind of like put aside because there are just so many cases that are relevant, right? There are like 200, maybe 300 cases. You're not going to put all of them before the judge, right? And it's easy to say like, well, this case is not very helpful to me, but it's also maybe not the most relevant case, and therefore I can, set it aside. I think when I was in Malaysia and facing this problem, I had the easy way. I had a boss. And so I just went to my boss and was kind of like, yeah, these are all the helpful cases. These are the two that I'm kind of not really sure about, and they're not very helpful, and I don't know what to do with them. And my boss was very much like, we got to put it before the judge. We have to put it before the judge, and we have to distinguish it. That's the kind of legal terminology, right? Which is basically to say, yes, these cases are unhelpful, but they don't really apply in our cases, or our case is different. Right, from this case, so therefore you don't have to follow this case. And I remember him telling me that like it goes to your integrity as a lawyer. Like, I think the worst case scenario is where you don't put a case before a judge and the judge happens to know of that case, and then you'll be in trouble because the judge will be like, why have you not talked about this case that I know exists? And why have you not brought this to my attention, right? And it goes to your integrity, right? They'll forever remember you as that lawyer who like purposefully omitted not to bring that case to his attention. So that's part of it. You need to protect your reputation in that way, and you want to be seen as an advocate that is always telling the truth, right? But also, like in a case where the judge doesn't know and doesn't know of the case, in some senses it's also practical to still put the case before the judge, because if it goes up on appeal, like the higher court judge might look at it and say, well, he obviously did not consider this case, and you would rather have it considered and put aside than not considered at all, because that's more helpful to your client. So there are lots of kind of good reasons for being ethical, but it's very easy in the moment to just feel like this is so unhelpful and I don't know what to do about it, and often maybe you can't distinguish the case, and then it becomes like I think that's an area that lawyers often need quite a lot of prayer for, like the wisdom and the discernment to do the right thing, figuring out what the right thing is to do, and having the courage to do it, even if it means, losing a case.
Yeah, thank you, Allyna. That's super helpful perspective to hear. I can imagine as a lawyer, and especially in the UK system where it's very much individual barristers who are self-employed, standing on your own 2 feet, you could feel a lot of pressure in that kind of exposed situation. Does that also come into this?
Yeah, actually exposed is quite a good word to describe it. Like often when you're in court, you do like you're the only person standing up in the room, you're the only person speaking. It does feel very exposed. I mean, the judge starts asking you questions that you don't know the answer to, you feel even more exposed. and I think the temptation there is obviously to kind of cover up, like sound like you know what you're doing. And yeah, that goes to kind of my first point about like how we need to be able to stand firm, right, in the things that are true. But yes, I think the difficulty about being a lawyer is that the pressure is not just sometimes from your client, or I guess in Malaysia where you have a boss from your boss. But like it's kind of a personal pressure. Like lawyers are very much tied to their work. It's a very personal type of job. Like when you research a case, when you write your submissions, when you present your submissions in court, like all of that is just mostly kind of your own work. Like sometimes you would have other people, well, when you operate in a law firm like in Malaysia where barristers are not self-employed, you maybe have a team working on you for the submissions. But lots of lawyers who eventually argue the submissions in court would rather write the submissions themselves, because that way it's kind of like their own words that they are saying in court, right? Rather than having someone write a script for you, it's just never going to come across as well. And so it's a very personal job, and like every case, it feels like every case reflects on your ability. Like when you win a case, it's a win for you as well as for your client. If you lose a case, it's a loss for you as well as for your client. And sometimes the you part becomes more important than the client part. Especially, I sometimes feel that when the client's like a company and like maybe all they stand to lose is money, and then you feel like, oh, you know, like they're not high stakes here. But I want to win anyway because it's my case, and like I want to be a good advocate, and I want to be like the winning advocate. And it's quite hard, I think, as a Christian to remember that my identity is not so much as a lawyer, but rather as a Christian. And that ultimately my worth doesn't come from, you know, the number of cases that I've won and or lost. I mean, this early on in my career, there's not that many wins or losses to my name anyway. And so, but even then, I do feel the pressure. I do feel the pressure to kind of perform. And even as a pupil, when I guess technically my work doesn't really contribute to anything right now, I'm just like kind of helping my supervisors, right? And ultimately, they're 15 years more experience than I am. So if something's rubbish, they're just going to change it anyway. And if it's great, they'll use it. But there's kind of no investment on my part for the client. But it still feels like I need to do well. There's this sense of like I must prove myself. I must prove that I'm a good advocate. Like all the work that I do needs to show how good of an advocate I am, how persuasive I am. And I think it's quite easy to take your losses very personally as well. I think often lawyers try to be friends with each other in court. And that's part of how the legal fraternity works, right? Like we're all part of the same system trying to work towards justice. And yes, you've got that case, I've got my case, but ultimately we can still be friends, right? We can still be cordial to each other. It's part of the professionalism of the profession. But like, it's quite easy to get upset at someone who is on the opposing side, especially when they make a point and you're kind of like, that's misleading, that's not true, you haven't told the judge about this case, what about this angle? And there's quite a lot of animosity between advocates sometimes because you feel very strongly about your case, and it's quite easy to feel like the other side's being unfair and for them to feel the same way about you. I think, like, for example, in the deportation case, when we lost, I remember the person in charge of the case was talking to us about it, and he was kind of like, maybe if I had just been more senior, maybe if I had asked like a more senior lawyer to argue the case, we would have won. And he was really down about it. And I don't think that that's true. I think we would have lost either way. But it's hard not to take it personally. When you lose an application, it's like, you just go home and you keep thinking about this, like, if I had answered the question in this way, if I had phrased it in that way, would it have made a difference? I should have just said this better, done this better. And it's quite hard to wrestle with that. And at the same time, it's hard to wrestle when you win and to be like, and not to be like, wow, I'm such a great advocate, right? So I think that's one of the other things that's maybe hard, that maybe lawyers need prayer for, that we remember that like ultimately our identity is in Christ. We could be a lawyer that has lost all of our cases and still be a valued, loved child of God. And our wins are not our wins and our losses are not our losses, but ultimately we are working towards furthering God's kingdom here on earth. And we can trust that God has control over the wins and the losses. And ultimately, he will bring about justice in a way that we cannot by our wins and losses here.
How do you think this has all shaped your relationship with the God of justice? Because there have been cases we've talked about which have brought you quite a lot of sadness, but also cases that you've won. It's not always the same outcome. So, yeah, please tell us how you found relating to the God of justice amidst all of this.
I think definitely when we lost that case, the one about the deportation, I struggled a lot with it. Like, I kind of felt like, is there really justice in this world? And yes, I know there will be justice when Jesus comes again. But is that really enough when people are, like dying, like today? And we can't wait till Jesus comes again. And like, well, maybe I can, but that person can't, right? And I think it's definitely something that I wrestle with, like why injustice happens today and why God doesn't help. Like, why didn't he help us win the case, Like, he could have just given us, a judge that was more favorable to our cause. That would have been it. It would have been easy. It wouldn't have harmed anyone else, if you think about it that way. Maybe God has many complex factors to take into account, but, it seems like this is quite an easy win for justice overall.
Sure.
I don't think it's something that I really have an answer to right now. I think part of it is realizing that, like, trusting in God's sovereignty. So while actually in the case of the deportation, I found out later on that that person had actually escaped the authorities in his home country and had somehow fled.
That's
he may or
amazing.
may not be back in Malaysia, but I cannot say that. I think that was one of the ways where I really felt like God saw my grief for this person, and he had answered in a way that, like, maybe I wouldn't have expected at the beginning.
Absolutely.
That seems quite self-centered. I mean, clearly God also saw the plight of that person, right? And it's not just because of me that that guy got saved. But it does feel a bit like, I guess it's a reminder that we have a God who is not uncaring about the difficulties and the sufferings that we face in the world today, even though he knows more perfectly than we do that one day it will all be made right. And so it's just like looking for those little glimpses of hope and kind of holding on to God in the meantime, trusting in his sovereignty. Like, all of these things are happening for reasons that maybe I cannot fathom, but God cares so much more about that one person than I do. Like, I don't know his family, his background. I probably don't even know his real name, but God does. And if I am grieved, how much more is God grieved? And how much more would he be doing what he thinks is good? And that's maybe something that I have to learn to trust.
Well, thanks so much, Allyna, for joining us today. It's been so encouraging, but also interesting to hear about your experience of training to becoming a lawyer and seeing how your faith in Christ as the one who brings ultimate justice, the one who is good and sovereign, has been helping you, and also for telling us how we can be helping you and praying for you. So thank you again, and we look forward to having you back on the podcast at some point. Thanks for tuning into the Overtones podcast today. Make sure to subscribe and tune in to the next episode on your streaming platform of choice.
Follow us and share our podcast with your friends on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us on both platforms as Overtones Think Tank.
And if you'd like to get in touch with feedback, comments, or other ideas, our email address is podcast@overtonesproject.com. See you next week.